Scripture reading this morning is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. Matthew 12, 1 through 8, and I'll be reading from the New International Version. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." He answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple desecrate the day and yet are innocent? I tell you that one greater than the temple is here. If you had known what these words mean, 'I desire mercy, not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the innocent, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Preach the word.
All right, good morning. All right, can I be heard? All right, good. Sounds good. I appreciate everybody taking the time. Of course, you have to be here, I know, but it's good to see everybody in here and to share with you in this as well. This morning, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about compassion in ministry. Now, I don't have slides going, and like was said in the prayer, I really wanted you to pay attention and listen to what was being said and take in what was being said. And I want to talk about compassion in ministry, the importance of having compassion as a major idea, a major way of service in ministry. It's important to ministry, and that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight as well. I used to preach in a little town west of here back in the 80s. And one Sunday morning, a song leader who led singing quite often got up to start our song service on that Sunday morning. And as he got up to start singing the song service, he got about halfway through the song, and then all of a sudden he had a beeper on his left side, and all of a sudden that beeper went off, and it was loud, and really loud. And he was leading the singing, and he kind of looked down at it, and then he just stopped. And he looked over at me, and I was sitting, close to the front, and he said, "Shawn, you're going to have to get up here and finish the song service today. I've got a call with the ambulance, and I need to go." And so he marched out the back and out the door, and we knew that he was a volunteer paramedic, but this was the first time that a service, quote, had ever been interrupted, and the song leader had to stop and turn it over to somebody else. And, we finished the song service, but afterwards we had 2 or 3 folks who came up to the front. We didn't have any elders, but we had some of them in and wanted to gather some of them in, and they made the demand that that person never ever lead the songs again on Sunday morning because they had some friends that were visiting that day, and they were so embarrassed that the song service got stopped in the middle of it with a beeper going off, and the song leader has to rush off. And, we thought about it a little while and that sort of thing, and the man felt like that wasn't a need that had to happen. And so about 5 weeks later, I waited a little bit on it, and I preached my lesson from Matthew chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, where ultimately, and that's what was read to you this morning, where ultimately what was being said and talked about was when it comes to people's lives and living, and it turned out on that ambulance call, he had to rush somebody to the hospital. It was, of course, an emergency, and that person had to be taken to the hospital and spent probably the next 2 or 3 days in the hospital. And I can't remember exactly what was wrong, but it was needed. Somebody needed to be with that patient, with that person. But I thought of this passage of Scripture. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Comes from Hosea. We kind of get the idea out of Micah as well. But the idea is that God, in that desire of mercy, over sacrifice. And you can see that especially in the Micah passage where God's not about what we're worshiping when our hearts aren't set on who he is and how that worship goes. Because God is set upon attitude. He's set upon the heart and what is within the heart. And that's what that illustrates. I have this idea that I think is true of this term, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, when I look at what mercy is. You know, Jesus makes the same statement in Matthew chapter 9, earlier in chapter 9, verse 13, when the Pharisees asked the disciples, why does your teacher, referring to Jesus, eat with tax collectors and sinners? And you know, that was offensive to these Pharisees, as Jesus would sit with sinners and with tax collectors. And most people know the battle that goes on between the legalistic Pharisees and those that they could control as well within that. And Jesus tells them when they ask that question, those who are well have need of a physician, but those who are sick, but those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick are the ones who need the physician. And so he says, go and learn what this means. And I like the way that Jesus puts that. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. And so Jesus helps us set in perspective this idea a little bit. Even though the word here for mercy, or I desire mercy, even though the word here is eleos in the Greek for mercy, it still carries the idea of having compassion. And I have no problem defining or translating that word eleos as compassion. As a matter of fact, there are 5 Hebrew words that are given to us that are translated compassion in the Old Testament. And when the Greek Septuagint was translated, most of the time, not every time, but most of the time that those 5 Hebrew words are translated that have this idea of pity and compassion, most of the time they use the Greek word eleos for whatever that Hebrew word is, as it has reference to compassion. So the idea was, even back in those days, the understanding that eleos, that we mostly translate mercy, was actually seen more along this idea, or the idea of it was compassion, having that picture of compassion. So I have no trouble defining that as I desire compassion and not sacrifice. Now, that helps me, especially as I begin to formulate my understanding of what ministry is. Now, I've been in ministry a long time, and it's taken me a time to see what ministry is about. And I've gone from different stages of what I thought ministry was about to coming to this idea that ultimately I think that this is what ministry is about. Compassion. Compassion for people. And not so much always about sacrifice. And I think sometimes we get a little backed up in that, or on our head on that a little bit, when we begin to think in the idea that we think more in terms of our sacrifice in ministry, and the sacrifice of worship, and the sacrifice of giving this up for God, and those sorts of things. And all those have a place, until I lose the concept of what compassion is and the importance of what it means to be compassionate in ministry. And so I've moved from different stages to ultimately coming to this idea that I think compassion needs to define our ministries more than they have previously. The concept is that when it's coupled with a desire to help that person who's going through that struggle, it has this idea of wanting to help relieve their suffering, help them relieve the pain or the hurt, whatever it was that was defined in that first part of it. So there's 3 parts to it. There's those parts where sympathy is the feeling bad for someone. Then it's the empathy. And empathy is feeling with someone their pain. And then there's splanchnizomai, that goes further with that understanding, is compassion is helping by sharing their burden, or helping individuals in their struggle. And I look at that, and that's what mercy is. Mercy is that third one. And so mercy is compassion, but mercy seems to be more specifically that third one where I want to help them with what they're struggling with in that relationship that I can build with somebody who's going through some aspect of hurting or struggling in life. And so I show mercy upon them by coming to them with those outward manifestations or expressions of helping them. And it all comes under this full picture of what compassion is about. Now, like I said, today, the lesson is mostly about the importance of compassion in ministry. The importance of having compassion as you go out and minister. And it's not one of those things, sometimes we think, well, compassion's not my gift. That's not what Scripture's going to tell you. Compassion is a necessity of everybody who goes out and ministers. It's everything that has to do with the Lord's church. We all need to have an aspect of compassion. Some are better at showing it in certain areas in certain ways, and that's where your spiritual gifts come in. But compassion is a requirement for this. Jesus took the step further when he used it to define the attitude that every believer should have and understand. And he taught it in his parables. He taught it in his sermons. Everywhere that he goes, he taught it, and we've already seen a number of examples. I can give you a number of examples. Matthew 18, verse 27, the parable of the merciful servant or the unmerciful servant. Bible says in verse 27 of Matthew 18, and out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave the debt. And of course, we know the story behind that. But the idea was that out of pity for him, and that word pity comes under the definition or our understanding of what compassion is. So Jesus ministered, he had compassion, and it's seen in the parables that he taught. In Luke 15, verse 20, it's the story of the prodigal. And he arose and came to his father, the prodigal son, there in verse 20 of Luke 15. The son rises out of his pigsty, I guess, and he comes back, decides, I'm just going to go home and ask to be a servant. And he arose and he came to his father. Now look at this. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. And he ran and embraced him and kissed him. Even the Father, of course representing God here, shows us that God, when he saw him, had compassion. And that's what caused God to run and take in the Son. Luke chapter 10, verse 13, the story of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan, when the Levite and the priest go about their duties, because that's what's important in ministry, is getting all those duties finished at the temple or in the law, wherever, but not here. Only the Samaritan recognized as he journeyed. And as he came to where he was, and when he saw him, that is, the person who had just been beat up and left for dead, the Bible says he had compassion. And he got down and cleaned his wounds, picked him up and put him on his donkey and took him into the inn. Now, that's a picture, and of course, I look at that and I think my duties are to make sure Sunday morning gets done, and my duties are to make sure the hospitals get visited. My duties are to make sure the building is ready, and my duties are to prepare the Lord. My duties are all of these things, and to lead the prayers and to teach the Bible classes and all those things. Those are my duties. And that's what those others were involved in. But Jesus tells us the real purpose here is, look, in the midst of all of that, don't forget about loving and having compassion on people. Well, there's other passages in Mark chapter 6, verse 34, the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus didn't want to send them off. He had compassion on them. Mark 9:22, it was the father whose son was possessed or by an unclean spirit. And he comes and he's begging Jesus, and your apostles couldn't do it, disciples couldn't do it. But if you can do anything, the Father asks, please have compassion on us and help us. There's people who are hurting and struggling, and Jesus understood that was what he was there to do. Primarily, Jesus was to provide compassion in his service and in his ministry. It's what it was about. Matthew 9, verse 36, when he saw the crowd, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless. That word harassed is they were getting torn up, literally, mangled by the Pharisees, by others around them, and they were helpless like sheep without a shepherd, and Jesus had compassion on them. That's what ministry is about. It's about seeing those who are lost in the midst of their compassion. Well, let's just close up in these last few minutes. Compassion is the pulse of authentic ministry. And I want you to hear that again. Compassion becomes the pulse of authentic. You want your ministry to be real? You want your ministry to have purpose and meaning? Here's some points real quick and I'm done. Compassion mirrors the character of Jesus. So I want to mirror the character of Jesus. Jesus consistently modeled compassion, feeding of the hungry, weeping with mourners, healing the sick, spending time with tax collectors and sinners. Christ's nature was to love others, share the good news of hope and salvation. Look at Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 21, and read that. It comes from what? Isaiah chapter 61. When Jesus came to help the brokenhearted and the captive, to bring freedom to a world that was held hostage and suffering and struggling. And it says that's what Jesus came to do. Jesus mirrored. Compassion mirrors who Jesus was. And that's what we need to be to the world. The second one, compassion in ministry creates connection and credibility for you. That's what makes ministry authentic. People are more likely to open up, to hear what you're preaching and listening to what you're teaching, to seek your counsel and confess their sin to you, and positively react to the gospel message when you show them your love, mercy, and compassion. Compassion breaks down barriers. It creates trust and respect, especially in moments when members or those who need to know Christ are struggling with grief and shame or crisis. And it allows you to begin to minister to them in those situations. And so it creates the connection and gives you credibility as being authentic. The third one, compassion in ministry guarantees ministerial efficacy. It helps you understand people's needs, and thus you can fashion what people need to hear in your preaching. When you have compassion, you understand where they're coming from. You understand the struggle that they're having in life, whether it's sin, whether it's abuse of drugs, whether it's alcohol abuse, or whether it's relational struggles in life. Ultimately, to be effective, to help them, compassion helps you do that. Compassion in ministry helps me see the need to do that, and therefore it helps you adjust how you minister to them and what you say to them from God's word. So compassion becomes very important in that regard. Compassion can transform and impact your preaching, your teaching, and your service, and your care when you approach it from an aspect of compassion for the person. The fourth one, compassion in ministry fosters an environment of grace, love, and truth. Most of the time when we see Jesus showing or having compassion on others, it is usually when it lays opposed to the legalistic and harassing teachings of the scribes and the Pharisees. Jesus goes to the other end and shows compassion. Compassion creates an atmosphere of hope, an atmosphere of let's work on this, rather than a harsh atmosphere of judgment. That's what you want your churches to be. Your relationships to be. Not people who are coming to find judgment, even though they need to understand that concept, but ultimately they know that there is hope, and that's what Jesus was about. Not fostering an atmosphere of judgment and legalism, but an atmosphere of grace, an atmosphere of love, an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. And there's lots of passages that speak to this. John 1:17, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John 10:10, the thief came only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that you may have life and have it abundantly. And then the last one, compassion in ministry helps me maintain an attitude of humility and dependence upon God. Ministry and preaching and teaching are not about me. It's about what glorifies God and honors Jesus. It's not a notch on my belt or on my Bible of how great a minister I am, but it's about drawing others to Jesus. Pride will make you see nobody else but yourself, and compassion for others gets lost. If compassion for others is first, then it can become the very strength and the meaning of your ministry. Micah 6:8, I'm through. He has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. This is what a ministry of compassion looks like.